There's a mitzvah in this week's parasha that many of us are probably not even familiar with, and if we have noticed it, we probably haven't paid much attention to it. And once we see what Rashi has to say about it, we'll realize that there is an intriguing backstory to this interesting halacha, breaking a kli cheres, an earthenware vessel that had been in contact with a korban chatas. So let's have a look. Bein dinei chatas and iskarim parasha nema. One of the halachas that is taught about the korban chatas in our parasha is the earthenware vessel. If you use one to cook the chatas in, the part that gets to be eaten, yeshaver, afterwards has to be broken. Whereas if instead you chose to cook it inside a copper container, then you've got to scrub it and clean it and do hag'ala, essentially, which is to put it into boiling water. So clearly it has to be somehow kashed. So Rashi comments on the word yeshava that you have to break. If it's an earthenware vessel, you have to break it. So Rashi wants to understand why would you have to break it, and he explains. Because there has been some of the taste of the Chatas offering that was then absorbed into the keli, and that's nasa noisar. That becomes noisar. Now, typically noisar means any part of a korban that went beyond the time within which you're supposed to eat it, and now it's considered essentially treif. Says Rashi, this doesn't only apply to Chatas offering, but actually to any korban that was, or any kochim, any holy items that were cooked inside an earthenware vessel. After the expiry time, you have to destroy the vessel. So we've got to ask ourselves, why is it the Rashi has to explain levoyer tam adin yeshava? Why is he explaining the reason behind it? Rashi is not a book of halachas. And how come Rashi has to say this doesn't only apply to the Chatas offering, but to other korbanos as well? Yeshlemer, but Pashtus is a very simple explanation. What's the simple explanation? Things don't happen in isolation. This pasuk about breaking the earthenware vessel in which you cook the chatas is a direct follow-on from the previous pasuk, which was Shaboy Ne'emar Adin the Dam Chatas. There we spoke about what happens if there's blood splatter from the chatas offering. Says the pasuk, that basically what happens is if there is some kind of splatter, some spray from the blood that gets onto a person's clothing, that part of the clothing has to be immersed in a mikveh. Now that thing that you have to basically purify an item of clothing that gets the blood of the Chatas offering, that is only about a Chatas, not in other korbanos. So Mistaver Lefarish would have been logical to say the halacha we're about to now learn, which is the next pasuk, that you have to break the earthenware vessel in which you cook the Chatas. Logic would tell you, okay, that's also a law that only applies to a korban Chatas. And the reason you'd say that is because the Chatas is one of the most, so to speak, strict offerings. You therefore have an instruction which is, as soon as you've finished participating in the korban chatas, you've got to get whatever was absorbed of that korban chatas into the keli out of there. In the same way as if blood got onto your clothes from the korban chatas, you immediately have to wash it out. And therefore the pasuk is telling us, and if you can't get the absorbed flavor out, like in the case of a kli cheres which has no way to kasher it, as Rashi is going to tell us, that something which is contaminated in a kli cheres, there is no way to fix it. So therefore the pasuk has to tell us, the only alternative then is to break the kli cheres, which by the way includes potentially putting it into a kiln and essentially reconstituting it. That's what you would have thought. You would have thought that the reason we're so strict over here about this kli cheres is because korban chatas is stricter than most korbanos. Comes along Rashi, and Rashi negates that insight. Because how does he do so? He tells us very clearly. Number one, tells us the reason you're breaking this earthenware vessel is not because the korban chatas is the strictest out of, or one of the strictest out of the korbanos. It's because of the nature of what has now been absorbed into this keli, which is noisar, which is technically treif, which of course would apply to any korban. Any korban that goes past its expiry date is noisar. You're not allowed to eat it, and therefore the keli within which that noisar resides has to either be kashed, if it could be kashed, or broken in the case of an earthenware vessel because it cannot be kashed. Because the halacha against having the korban beyond its allocated time applies to every single korban. And therefore this halacha is not like the halacha of the blood and that gets on your clothes in the previous pasuk. There was only a chatas halacha. The only thing is we have to ask ourselves the reason behind this. If I'm looking at the pshat of the pasuk, which is what Rashi does, what's pushing me to explain? Where in the pasuk did I see that the reason I'm breaking this earthenware vessel is because what's been absorbed into it is noiser, and therefore I could obviously apply to every single carbon that any time that there's something which goes beyond its allocated time, you have to get rid of it. Why don't I just read this at face value, following the context and flow of the psukim, which is shehudin meyuchad bechatas, that this is something unique that only applies to a carbon chatas, al derech din dam chatas shlifnei, which would be very similar to the story that you have to wash out the blood of a carbon chatas that gets onto your clothing, which is only about a carbon chatas. And the truth is, if the reason why you have to break this klicheres is because what got into it is now the blia, the absorption of something which is now no longer edible because it is noisar, the pshat of the pasuk has two things about it that actually seem to negate that suggestion. Number one, aleph. The concept of noiser does not really seem something which could logically apply to the invisible, absorbed flavor of something into a keli. The meaning of leftovers is leftovers. Leftovers after Shabbos is the same food you had on Shabbos. So noiser implies that it's actually a piece, a visible, tangible piece of korban that has gone past its allocated time. Whereas the invisible flavor that has been absorbed into the keli, it's not something you could eat. Surely it's not really noisar. So pshat would not lend itself to saying that noisar is the reason you have to break this klicheres. Number two, if the reason I have to break the klicheres is because what's absorbed into it has the status of noisar, then logically and logically, the time to break this earthenware vessel should not be straight after I've cooked and eaten from it. Rather, the halacha should be when the time frame for the carbon chatas has passed, then I have to break the klicheres because now what's inside it is considered noiser. Then the pasuk should have told me those laws, should have told me when I have to break this klicheres. In the same way as the Torah told me that if the meat of the carbon extends beyond a particular time, it becomes noiser. So it's not absolutely clear in Pshat that we are talking over here about a case of noiser that applies to all karbanos as opposed to a unique halacha in the carbon chatas. So where did Rashi get it from? Now, before we can analyze that, let's look at something else Rashi says in the very next comment. So now continuing Rashi's explanation, Rashi takes out of the pasuk the word umoirak and explains what it means. It's like a scrubbing item that you use when in beauty care. Then after that, then he takes the words which say you have to scrub and essentially boil up water and immerse the pot. And he says, the reason you're doing this process is to remove that absorbed flavor that got into the keli. But if it's an earthenware vessel, well, here the Torah is teaching you that there is no way to get rid of the contamination. Now, there are two things about this which are very strange. It's not clear. When Rashi explains those words, where he explains that the reason you're doing this is in order to get the flavor out, and you cannot do that in the case of a klicheres. That is a direct continuation from what was just explained before, which is why you have to break the klicheres, because you cannot get that flavor out. So they link. And you can't get the flavor out, and therefore that which is absorbed into the klicheres has now got the status of noiser, which is the problem, which is why you got to break it. If that's a direct link, then logically what Rashi should have done is he should have explained Yeshaver, you break the klicheres because it's got noisar, and then straight away go into the conversation and say, whereas if it was a copper vessel, you'd be able to actually kasher it, and that does not apply to klicheres. That's a logical flow. He shouldn't have stopped and interrupted by saying, let me explain to the grammatical source of the word moirak. He could have first explained the concept and then explained the word. As we frequently find that Rashi does, frequently Rashi explains first the theme, the message, and then he gets into the words. And by the way, about that, how he explains the concept of that you can kasher the copper, but not the kli cheres, also seems a bit strange, because look at how Rashi concluded that conversation. He said, if it's an earthenware vessel, here the pasuk teaches us that there's no way to clean it from contamination. Mashma, that implies that means that Rashi is implying when the Torah told me break the kli cheres, I didn't realize that means you can't kasher it. How do I know that you can't kasher it? Because it tells me that I can kasher the copper. And when I see that you can kasher the copper, and I realized before that the Torah said you had to break, now I only realize that you can't kasher the kli cheres. That's so strange. Why couldn't Rashi say the Torah says break an earthenware vessel? I'll tell you why. Because you cannot kasher it. Besides, Rashi's telling us the reason you're breaking the kli cheres is because there's noiser absorbed into it. So, if you're telling me what the problem is, that it's absorbed the flavor of this korban, which is now noiser, and you're not allowed to eat noiser, and you're telling me I have to break the kli cheres, I understand. Well, there's obviously no other way to fix it. Then, because if there was a way to kasher the earthenware vessel, then what am I doing? So I'm breaking it. So it's still got the same problem. There's still the noiser in its walls. It's just now in broken pieces instead of a single earthenware vessel. So what did I achieve if there is still a way to kasher? So clearly, the fact you're telling me to break it means it can't be kasher. Whereas if it's the copper vessel that I can kasher, I then get rid of the problem completely. So if you're telling me that I have to break it, you're telling me there's no way to get rid of the problem. If that's the case, why does Rashi say only when you get to the copper vessel? Now, mikan, from here we learn that you cannot kasher kli cheres. Shlomo Abir Bozeh, the explanation is as follows. Remember we said that these two psukim follow on? Well, in the previous pasuk, we identified one out of two halachas that the previous pasuk said. What are they? Firstly, the Torah told us halacha about the meat of the korban chatas. If there's other food that touches the meat of the korban chatas, it also becomes like holy food. Which means, as Rashi explains, called dvar any food stuff that now absorbs some of the korban chatas becomes like it. Because some of the korban chatas has now been absorbed into this regular food, the regular food is now at the status of a korban, like the pasuk said, yikdosh. Which means, if the korban chatas for any reason was disqualified, Rashi says clearly, then this food now is considered like disqualified korbanos. And if it's not disqualified, then it has to be eaten with all the stringencies that apply to a korban. That's rule number one. The effect of the meat of the korban chatas on other foods. Rule number two, which we've already touched on, Beis, din b'shaychus dam chatas, a halacha that applies not to the meat, but to the blood. That if there is blood splatter, then you've got to go and you've got to now put that part of the clothing in the mikveh. They were speaking not about absorption, talking about splatter. And we're not talking about something where the issue at hand over here is that the blood is now being absorbed into the cloth. Rather, the pasuk is telling us because the blood which hit this cloth happens to come from a korban chatas. So you got to now get that blood out of the clothing. How do you do that? You got to put it into the mikveh. And that's what Rashi tells us. You don't have to necessarily immerse the entire garment, just the part that was splattered with blood. So we have two halachas. A halacha about the meat of the korban chatas that absorbs into other food and changes the status of that food, versus the blood of the korban chatas that splatters onto a garment, and then that part of the garment has to be purified. Our pasuk continues from that. Therefore, now we get to our pasuk, which speaks about what happens if you cook the meat of the korban chatas inside a kli cheres. Where the problem is, there's an absorption of the flavor of the korban chatas into the vessel. How did that happen? That absorption happened because there was heat, and heat causes things to absorb. So now logically, the status of this halacha is not going to be the same as the status of the blood splatter halacha. This is the halacha of things that are absorbed, which is more like the korban chatas affecting the food through the absorption of the flavor of the korban chatas into that food. So this is going to be in the same halacha of the food that touches the korban chatas. Meaning that the Torah first tells me about what happens when the korban chatas flavor gets absorbed into other food, and then it tells me what happens, the same process, except the recipient this time is not food, it is a keli, and there's two possibilities: it's an earthenware or it's a copper keli. Therefore, Rashi's logic is, why are we breaking the kli cheres? Not because the chatas is stricter than other korbanos, and mitzad isur noiser, because something was absorbed into this kli cheres, which is going to go beyond the time frame in which you could eat it, which will turn it into noiser, which you're not allowed to have. What Rashi has done for us now is he is aligned to similar halachas that they actually operate in a similar fashion. The halacha of the flavor of the korban chatas being absorbed into food, now the status of the chatas becomes the same status as the food. Likewise, there's the absorption of the flavor of the korban chatas into the kli cheres, therefore the status of the korban chatas is going to affect the kli cheres. If this is noisar, the kli cheres is off limits. In the same way as the fact that the korban chatas affects the other food by touching it, not because the korban chatas is a unique case. Because the truth is, we have precedent that even a korban mincha, which is not, so to speak, at that elevated status of the korban chatas, or as strict as the korban chatas, but it has the same effect. There tells you clearly, anything that touches the korban mincha is also sanctified. Rashi says, same thing, that if there's something of a lesser status, kochim kalim, or things that are not kodesh at all, that touch the mincha, they get to take on the status of the mincha. Exactly the same principle. They have been boleya, they have absorbed the korban aspect, flavor into it, and therefore they take on the nature of that korban. So therefore this is not some kind of super rational decree of the Torah that a korban chatas operates in a unique way. Rather, it's a logical principle that that's how things work in Torah. That if something absorbs the flavor of something else, it affects its status. In this case, to take on the status of a korban. Now, following the same logic, if the absorption of flavor into food is not something which is mandated by the Torah, but something which makes sense, then if the flavor of the korban chatas is absorbed into the kli cheres, same thing. It's not some super rational law of the Torah. It's logical. And if it's logical, it doesn't only apply to the korban chatas. So what's the logic? The absorbed material takes on the status of noiser, which is problematic, and therefore I've got to get rid of it. If I can't get rid of it, I've got to get rid of the keli. Now, one of our questions was, how come the Rashi is not learning out of the clear word yishaver that you have to break this kli cheres? How come that doesn't tell us that there's no way to clean the kli cheres? You have to wait until you hear the halacha as it applies to the copper vessel, and only then you can say, kli cheres, there's no option, you have to break it. Because we're saying the reason you're going to break it is because there's the absorption into it. And that applies to all korbanos. So why do you have to learn out of the copper? We've already made the link. The reason or the logic behind why you have to break the kli cheres that absorb the flavor of the korban chatas is why? Because it is similar to the food that came into contact with the korban chatas and therefore absorbed its flavor and takes on its status. So now you're going to make this connection. You're going to say, okay, so the breaking of the kli cheres is somehow similar to and linked to the fact that the food that touches the korban chatas becomes holy and has to be treated in a particular way. In other words, kishem We've already identified that when a person mixes food with the korban chatas, the food now becomes komoya like the korban chatas, and therefore has to be treated with respect and with holiness. That all of the laws that govern the korban chatas now apply to this food. So you'd think, okay, same thing now applies to this keli. You might think, okay, the food became like a korban chatas. Maybe the keli becomes like a korban chatas, and therefore has to be broken. So I'd look at this and say, the flavor of the korban chatas got absorbed into this kli cheres. Therefore, the kli cheres becomes like a korban chatas. Therefore, because it becomes like a korban chatas, which is going to have to be, it's a process that you have to use when meat of a korban is past its sell-by date. Well, you've got to do the same kind of thing with the keli. You've got to break it. So that would be a misunderstanding. I wouldn't know that it's necessarily because there's something about a kli cheres that it can never be cleansed. Because if the logic says, like the food became like a chatas, the keli becomes like a chatas, and who cares if I get the food out or not? Let's say there was a way to kasher this kli cheres. I'd still have a logical reason to say you've got to break the kli cheres, not because what's inside it is problematic, but because it has been turned into a chatas. So the keli is noiser now. But when I get to the next point, which is, if this is a copper vessel, scrub it and do a hagala on it. Now I realize that if there's a way to get that chatas flavor out of the keli is now still usable. I don't have to get rid of the keli. And I see that that's different to a kli cheres. Then that means you're saying to him is that yes, I can now learn that the definition of the keli, in this case the kli cheres, when the kli cheres I cannot get the absorption out. Here, so the Torah is telling me the problem is the kli cheres, not the kli. In other words, I could have thought that when food touches a chatas, that food gets elevated to a chatas, has to be treated like a chatas. Maybe in the same way, when a keli touches the keli becomes like a chatas, has to be treated like a chatas, which means if the chatas at a certain point becomes noise and you can't use it, the keli at a certain point becomes noise and you can't use it. Why are you breaking the kli cheres? Because the kli cheres is noiser. Then I discover it's not so simple. Because if it's a copper vessel, if I have a way to kasher it, which means I get the chatas flavor out of it, the keli doesn't remain like a chatas. Keli is usable. So then what's the reason I had to break the kli cheres? Must be not because the kli cheres changed status once it touched the chatas, but it must be because I can't get the stuff out of the kli cheres like I could get it out of a kli nechoshis. Oh no, I'm moving, but it's still not so clear. Let's think about it. In both scenarios, you have the possibility of absorbed flavor from a korban inside a keli beyond the time frame, which makes it nicer. Well, maybe you've kind of like trafed up the keli. The keli's maybe become like a noiser. Well, how come you can keep it if it's made out of copper? And then I would have thought that the reason why you have to break the kli cheres, which cannot be kashed, it's not because something happened to the keli, it's because something's in the keli that I can't get out, and the stuff in the keli is a problem. Rashi also negates that perspective. How does he negate it? By first talking about the halacha of the kli cheres that it has to be broken, then changing tack and giving us the definition of the word moirak, and only then coming back to the halacha of how it works with the kli nechoshis. What does he explain that moirak is? L'shein tamrukei hanoshim chulei. It's part of this cleansing, that this personal hygiene thing that women do. Rashi has given us the explanation of this when he explained the word in Megillas Esther, dvarim ha-mitzachtzichin, something that you use to shine or to scrub. What Rashi's just done for us is he's linked, in the same way as we already had a link between the kli cheres and the kol hanogea b'bsar chatas yikdash, we now have a link between a morak v'shutaf, this idea of cleansing, with the blood splatter of the korban chatas, where the garment has to be cleansed. Behind the meaning. Beis hadinim b'pasuk didan, the two halachas in our pasuk, which is v'chli cheres v'im v'chli nechoshes, that you have to break the kli cheres, but you can kasher the kli nechoshes. Hey me'ein beis hadinim b'pasuk hakoidem, they are very similar to the two halachas that were in the previous pasuk, which is kol asher yiga goimer, that any food that touches the korban chatas takes on the status of the korban chatas, v'asher yizem midama, and anything that gets blood splatter has to be mikved. When I'm talking about this kli cheres, where there is no practical way to kasher it, to get the absorbed flavor out of it, that's pretty close to the halacha about the food that touched the korban chatas and absorbed the korban chatas into it, and therefore is considered like the korban chatas. As Rashi called it. Food that touched and therefore absorbed from it. Of course, there is no way to extract that absorbed flavor from the food. Therefore, the only thing that could happen is the korban chatas now influences this food to take on the status of the korban chatas. Something very similar happens with the kli cheres. That the kli, the actual vessel, becomes in a certain way like the noisa that lives inside of it. And if you've got to get rid of this problem, the only way to do so is to break this kli cheres. Base, the second thing that we learn is the fact that when you're dealing with a metal container, like in this case copper, where it is possible to kasher to extract the absorbed flavor, that actually has similarity to when there's blood splatter on a person's clothes. We know that there's a way to clean the clothes, get rid of the blood. So there the halacha is, doesn't now become like some unique kind of clothing that has to be treated like a korban chatas. Rather, the halacha is, get rid of the blood. Similarly, just in the same way as you can clean the blood, therefore you have to. You can kasher copper, therefore you have to. And therefore, and therefore I don't have any mitzvah to destroy, because normally noise has to be burned. I don't have to burn this kli nechoshes, which effectively means to break this kli nechoshes. I just got to get the bad stuff out of it and get rid of that. So now that we've made the link that the cleaning of the beged, the cleaning of the kli nechoshes is similar to the cleaning of the beged. Now we get another layer of insight into why it is that Rashi broke up the interpretations of kli cheres and kli nechoshes with the explanation of the meaning of the word umayrak. Rashi actually wants to clarify for us that the process of cleaning and kashering a kli nechoshes is a very different process to the breaking of a kli cheres. You would have thought they're the same process. It's getting rid of the absorbed flavor that is noisar. There's actually more to it. Because you would have argued, both of these are processes that achieve the same result. What's the result? You destroy the noiser. In the kli cheres, the practical way to do it is you can only break the kli cheres because there's no way to kasher it. And in the kli nechoshes, you have an option. You could actually kasher it as well. Says Rashi, no, there's more than that. It's not just two practicalities for the same malacha. And so there are two different frameworks at work over here. When it comes to the Torah told us that a korban chatas is an unusual case. It's not like other korbanos, and therefore, if the blood splatters on your clothes, you got to fix it. You got to clean the clothes. Not because the blood does something to make the clothes unfit or asur, etc. So likewise, when it comes to the halacha that says that you've got to clean and kasher the copper vessel, in our chiyuv, the fact that the Torah is requiring me to kasher that copper vessel is not just because what's absorbed into it is considered noiser, which was the focal consideration with a kli cheres. But rather, it's because there is korban chatas inside the keli, and you've got to remove the korban chatas out of the keli, which you can through kashering, and therefore you have to. And we'll explain shortly how come it is that in the kli cheres we're automatically calling it noisar, whereas in the kli nechoshes we're saying it's psar chatas that potentially later could become a noisar. But that's not actually our focal issue. That will help us to understand the distinction. It's really interesting when it tells us generally the principle of kashering. It says if something was used through fire, then in other words dry heat, then the only way to kasher is through fire, i.e. dry heat. As Rashi explains, whatever the method was that you used this particular item, that's the matching method that you have to use to kasher it. Anything that's used with dry heat can only be kashered through dry heat, etc., as we know from the halachas of kashering kelim. Here it doesn't say that. Here it says that you have to clean it and you have to kasher it. Now, when I'm kashering something that was non-kosher, my intention is get the non-kosher out of this place so I could use it. To do that, put it in boiling water. That should be good. If I have a copper thing that was used for cooking, put it in boiling water. We'll kasher it. But here we say not just put it into hot water. We're saying on Moirak, you first got to do a whole cleansing process, which is similar to the fact you've got to wash the blood out of that piece of clothing that got the blood splatter. It's not good enough only to use the method of hag'olah, which is regular kashing, which removes the absorbed inappropriate flavor. And the Torah is telling me I have to do more than that. I've got to do this whole scrub of the keli before I can even put it into the hag'olah. That's similar to washing, right? If you've got a blood stain, you're going to be washing out the blood stain. So the Torah is implying over here that you've got to do something similar to the cleaner choshes in order to get the blia out of it. And why is that? So to answer that, we're going back to the original question we asked at the beginning of the Sikha, which was, how can, according to Pshat, the fact that the korban chatas flavor was now absorbed into this keli, how do you call that noisar? Noisar usually is something you can see and touch. Leftovers. Noisar is usually only from a particular time frame. Here the Torah didn't tell me a time frame. You shove one in the Torah, tell me at which point I have to do this process. So as Rashi so cleverly does, the words that he uses gives us tremendous insight into what's going on over here. Rashi says that what is absorbed into the kli cheres, because that's what he talks about it, becomes noisar. Becomes noisar. Not will later, when it passes its time, be noisar. As it is absorbed, becomes noisar. What does that mean? Rashi is telling us something phenomenal. The moment korban chatas flavor is absorbed into a keli, that keli is now with noisar inside it. What does that mean? It's a beautiful and simple explanation. Geder noisar derech pshat. The simplest understanding of the word noisar is it's not like if I eat this food after this time, I've transgressed noisar. It's that the Torah said I'm only allowed to eat it until this point. Once it's noisar, I don't have access to this food anymore. It's not like if I access it, I've done an aveira. I don't have access to the food. Which means the Torah made two precursors or two requirements, two rules for the karbonos. Torah expects me to eat the meat of a korban within the allocated time frame. But let's say I can't, for whatever reason, get to eat it. I can't just keep it on the shelf or in the fridge. I've got to get rid of it immediately. Even if it's not yet the time. And it's the same thing that we're going to apply over here to whatever of that korban chatas has now been absorbed into these kelim. ubatel mimenu shem oichel. The fact that this is no longer food inside the keli, there's no piece of meat inside the keli. There is the absorbed flavor. That's not called food. I can no longer eat this. Remember, noiser means something that I'm not able to eat. The stuff that's inside the keli, the absorbed flavor, I cannot eat it. Therefore, I immediately have a responsibility to burn it, because noiser has to be burnt. Therefore, the halacha is shekli, I should shalbo yishamer. Therefore, if I've cooked the meat of the korban chatas in a kli cheres, now I've got to break it. Immediately I have the responsibility to burn the noisar, which is the stuff inside the kli cheres that cannot be eaten. The only way you can do that in the context of a kli cheres, you've got to break it. This is yet another example of how the precision of Rashi's language deals with issues that the commentaries get into major debates about. Rashi, the Re'im asks a question. How come Rashi says, how come you have to break the kli cheres? Because what's absorbed into it is noiser. Don't you know that there's an opinion? We say that if something sits for 24 hours absorbed into a keli, it's already what's called nois and tam nifagam, and therefore it's kind of lost its flavor. It's become an unattractive flavor, and therefore all the halachas are essentially in a sense easier. That's why we wait 24 hours before we kash something, etc. There's even an opinion that linas lailo pegam. It doesn't have to be 24 hours. If the flavor has been absorbed and stayed overnight, it's pegam. It's already something which we don't consider an halachic problem. Shkeni das Rashi, which happens to be Rashi's opinion. So the Re'im asks, in the morning, when the time for eating the korban chatas is up, and now you've got this problematic absorbed flavor inside the keli, the flavor that is inside the keli is no longer an edible flavor. If it's no longer edible, it's no longer a kashrus problem, or in this case a noiser problem. So why do you have to kasher it? In other words, the Re'im is saying, by the time you hit the noiser problem, you no longer have a food problem, or a kashrus, because all kashrus, all belia, all laws of the absorption of something, in this case not treif, in this case kochem, into another item is, does it have the taste? Have you absorbed the taste? And if that taste is no longer an edible taste, don't consider it. So the Re'im is asking, by the time you get to the point of noisa, which is the next morning, according to you, Rashi, it's nois and tam nifgam, it no longer has a viable flavor. It's not something which is a kashrus problem. Why do you have to kasher it? Why do you have to smash the kli cheres? Now we know. Rashi, when you pay attention to his words, totally circumvents this question in the first place. Mishum Shalafishitas Rashi, because Rashi's approach is Befirushi Allah Teresh by Mefarish Pshuta Shomrika. We're not talking Rashi, the halachic authority. We're talking about Rashi, the Pashton, explaining the simplest explanation of the Torah. The minute that flavor is absorbed into the keli, it is no longer food. The definition of noiser is something I cannot eat. Well, if it's no longer food, I cannot eat it. Therefore, it's noiser already now. Therefore, I have to kasher the keli immediately now. And if it's a kli cheres, there's no way to kasher it. Got to smash it. And that is obviously the distinction between the two kinds of vessels described over here. The very fact that the second something is absorbed into a material, it is no longer food. Therefore, it is noiser immediately. So the truth of the matter is that's something which is only relevant in a kli cheres, which has no way to extract the flavor again. There is no way you could ever eat this food ever again, even as a flavor for another food you're going to cook the next time you use this container. If it's noiser immediately. That's why I've got to break this kli cheres, and there's no time frame. It's got to happen essentially immediately, because it's immediately like burning noiser. As Rashi says, that which is absorbed into the walls of this kli cheres is noiser right now. But if it's a clean choishes, it's a metal container, and therefore there's the possibility that I heat it up and that extracts the flavor again back into whatever I'm cooking next. In Abriya Pailas in Noisar. So then the very fact that flavor was absorbed into the walls of this clean choishes doesn't automatically render it as Noisar, because the fee because it's not out of the question that I could end up eating this flavor again in my next food. I can now cook another foodstuff in this container. And the new included flavor from the residual carbon chatas flavor is now added to the flavor. I'm eating it. So then why do I have to go through the scrubbing and kashering of this cleaner choishes? It's not because I have a problematic noiser flavor in there that I've got to get out, because by the time it passes its sell-by date, it's no longer an issue at all. And if it comes into the food within the time frame, it's technically okay. That's because remember, this is the part that's compared to getting the blood out of the clothes. You've got to get the taste out of the keli. That's what the Torah says. It's a chomer in Chatas. And that's now we have the flow of how Rashi explains these psukim. First, he explains that if it's a cleaner choishes, the way you do things is clean it out. Why? Because the halacha is you've got to get rid of what came from the chatas into the space. In the context of a copper vessel, the whole kashering process is cleaning rather than removing a problematic absorbed flavor. And in order to highlight for us the difference, that when you're dealing with a copper vessel, it's not the same degree of absorption, the noise problem like you have in a kli cheres, because there is still the potential of using it. Therefore Rashi says, so let me illustrate the difference. But when you're dealing with a kli cheres, here the Torah shows us that there is no way to get the flavor of the carbon chatas out of the walls of the kli cheres. Therefore, the moment there is flavor absorbed into the kli cheres, that flavor is noise has to be gotten rid of, and you cannot kasher it, you've got to break it. And yet again, here's an example of where Rashi shows us a fascinating insight into halacha. These halachas, when they come into the Rambam, the Rambam and the Ravid have a difference of opinion. The Rambam, unlike what we've just seen in Rashi, is of the view that when the Torah tells us you have to break the kli cheres that had the carbon chatas in it, gzeres hakos, if it's only for a carbon chatas, can it be applied elsewhere? Whereas, if you cooked any carbon inside a copper vessel, you'd have to go through the kashering process described over here in the pasuk, regardless of which carbon it is. The Ravid, on the other hand, believes and they're both halachas, that if any carbon is cooked inside a kli cheres, you have to break the kli cheres afterwards. And if any carbon is cooked inside a kli nechoshus, you have to kasher it afterwards. Shittas Rashi Mahi, Rashi has a third opinion. When it came to the kli cheres, Rashi said you have to break the kli cheres of a chatos. And that applies also to all karbanos, because it's not a gzeres hakosef, it's a logical process, because you've got something in there which is considered noiser, and you've got to get rid of it. Whereas with the process of how you kasher and clean the cleaner choishes, Rashi doesn't bring up anything about the fact that it applies to other korbanos. And simply put, you'd say, well, maybe it's just he doesn't feel the need to repeat himself because he's already told us in the case of the kli cheres that it applies to all korbanos as well. That's what you'd think. But once we saw how Rashi distinguishes between the fact that once there's an absorbed flavor into a kli cheres and there's no way to get it out, it is noiser already from now. Whereas in a kli nechoshus, it's not necessarily that way, because technically you could cook something else and that will bring out the flavor of the chatas, and it could still be within the time frame. That implies that Rashi actually has a third perspective different to both the Rambam and the Ravid. The idea of breaking a kli cheres, well, that's something which applies to every single carbon, because logically every single carbon has the same problem, that the minute the flavor has been absorbed into the keli, it is no, so it's inaccessible and therefore has to be burnt, which in this case means you've got to break the kli cheres. Whereas Rashi is of the view that the cleansing process that you have to use for the cleaner choishes is learned from and therefore similar to cleaning the blood out of a beged, that is something reserved only for the korban chatas, because the korban chatas is a unique case, and therefore, unlike the Rambam, who would say that applies to all kochim, Rashi would say no. Sorry, according to the Rabbi, who says that both halachas apply to all korbanos, Rashi would disagree, and it'd say no. The special kashing process for a kli nechoshes is reserved only for a korban chatas. Mitzvah Hashem, we should be zoichet to be in a position that we can bring a korban chatas for whatever it is that we've got to sort out from the Zman HaGolus with the Mashiach right now.